Hey folks, and welcome back to Eric in the Kitchen, where this week I am making and reviewing the walnut cinnamon slices from the Tartine Cookbook. Tartine, if you don't know them, is a famous bakery based out of San Francisco. I'll leave a link to their social media and cookbook in the description down below. This recipe is very thorough in terms of putting together the mise en place, so doing each step incrementally and building up to the final product, preparing all of your ingredients ahead of time. We start by just whisking together cinnamon, baking soda, and flour in a small bowl until it's fully incorporated, and then we're going to set that aside for quite a while. Once that's fully homogeneous, we're going to get on to the next steps here, again following this mise en place preparatory approach that I have to give the recipe deep credit for. Like any good cookie, this next step involves butter, and in this case we're dealing with softened butter that we want to cut into fairly small pieces so they'll be easier to bring together. You can use either a stand mixer or a spatula, as I did here, to bring this together. You're just trying to cream the butter and the sugar together thoroughly, but without adding any air to it, since we're not trying to create a leavened cake or anything like that, or even a chocolate chip cookie. We're aiming for much closer to a shortbread, which means no air. So just bring it together until it's fully incorporated, and we'll get on to the next step here. So we add some salt to an egg, whisk it together, and then we're going to add that egg very quickly into the butter mixture and bring it together. This can take a little while. You want to get fully homogeneous before you proceed to adding back in the flour mixture. If I'm going a little fast, pause at any time, or just check out the cookbook in the link down below. So bring this together using either your spatula, a stand mixer, or your hands. Try not to overmix it. You don't want this to be too tough by overactivating the gluten. And then we're going to chop the walnuts. These are completely raw, and you want a pretty rough chop according to the recipe here. Once you've got those all prepared, we're going to move back over to our dough, add in the walnuts, and just quickly with our hands or spatula, I found spatula to be much more difficult here, work the walnuts into the dough, being careful again not to overmix it. You want the walnuts to be well distributed and sort of homogeneous throughout in terms of their consistency, but again, we're trying not to activate the gluten, so even though there's going to be a rest, try to be as gentle with it as possible. We're then instructed to pat the dough out into a 1-inch thick rectangle and cover it and chill it for 4 hours in the fridge. This is where the difficulty started for me because the dimensions of the rectangle weren't otherwise specified, so I just pressed it down the best I could, ended up with something probably closer to about 1/2 inch, which is on me, and wrapped up and put it in the fridge for the designated 4 hours. Unfortunately, this caused some problems for me in a later step because while the dimensions here were unspecified, it turned out that the dimensions were important to later steps, as we are told to cut into 2-inch logs this rectangle that we have. I had gone a bit too square and in fact hadn't aligned with 2-inch thick logs, so I ended up with some leftover dough on the edges. I also ended up a little thinner than I had thought, which ended up being another challenge when I was asked to cut it down to only being 1/4 of an inch thick. Now, fortunately, that only meant I had to do 1 cut as opposed to 4 had I gone for the whole inch. But this is an area that I felt the recipe was asking a lot more technique. These cuts weren't trivial given the amount of nuts, and I couldn't be as consistent as I'd like with pastry. Anyhow, we pressed forward, and after making a couple trial cuts, we ended up with these 2-inch wide at 1-inch tall-ish logs, and brushed them with our egg wash before tossing them in granulated sugar. This is supposed to give them a crunch, and the recipe talks about this in particular. This took me a little while to get the hang of, to get the exact right amount of egg wash to get the flour to stick, and while it says toss in it, I found that the egg wash was sufficiently sticky that actually it was better to just pour sugar over the top, as the egg wash would collect pretty much everything that it said in the recipe, even though it was asking for quite a lot. So once this was all done, the next step was to then cut these logs again, and what we're trying to do here is get into 2-inch by 1-inch by 1/4 inch. And yes, the proportions here aren't quite exactly right. I had some difficulties cutting through the nuts. Again, making these crosswise cuts was actually very difficult to do repeatedly and consistently across all of them. I felt that this was really technique heavy, and even though I will admit I didn't measure properly, I felt that this was still overly difficult. This could easily be rolled out into a 1/4 inch thick before being chilled. It would chill more quickly, and then it could be cut with a pizza cutter into the desired shapes. Anyhow, I put these in the oven and left them there for the desired 7 minutes, but when I checked on them then, they hadn't really goldened at all on the edges, so I left them for an extra 2.5 minutes to try to follow the instructions as best as possible, and attempted to remove them from a baking sheet, which unfortunately didn't go so well until after about 5 minutes. Getting to the tasting and the review of these cookies, the cookies themselves are kind of fine. They're sweet, they're warm, and they're walnutty. And I speak of warm in terms of flavors here. They aren't particularly crunchy. They're fairly soft and kind of complemented by the crunch of the walnuts. And I'm not complaining about them, but I didn't go back for seconds. I was hoping for something a bit more cinnamon forward that complemented the walnuts with some toasty flavors. Indeed, the recipe mentioned that the walnuts would develop a toasty flavor in the oven. So I was kind of on the fence with this one. And ultimately, I think my takeaway here is that this was a fairly difficult recipe to follow along with, given the amount of complexity in the cuts and the individual steps. I didn't feel that they delivered on the promise needed to fulfill that level of technique. So while this is still an interesting cookie, especially for an afternoon tea or something, it's not one I'd be doing very often. There are others, such as Claire's English muffins that we did a couple weeks back, that I absolutely would, and I encourage you to check out. So I'll be doing this more often on this channel, so please leave me comments down below of which recipes I should try next. Like and subscribe if you're new around here, and I will see you next week.